Let me start with a disclaimer. I don't tell ghost stories. No. So if you're here, on false expectations, I talk about history. And I find in most cases the history is more interesting or more amusing or more gruesome than a ghost story might be. So we're going to talk about real things. How many of you have heard me talk somewhere else in the last 30 days? Well, okay. I was going to make a test and ask you what I talked about, but maybe this one you remember. I want to read to you a true account. I got this from the first person, who at the time was a retired middle school, junior high principal. He was raised in the very northern extremes of our county, just very close to the border with Davidson County. He and his brother were big fishermen. It was nearly midnight when the Sweeney brothers finished stringing trot lines across the creek mouth one summer evening in the waning days of the 19th century. Everybody know what a trot line is? I think they may be illegal today, but it's where you string across the creek with all the hooks. Yeah. They were walking back across the Bryant place in the bright moonlight when they heard a wagon coming down the gravel road. The road is now the old Couchville Pike. Was coming at a very fast pace. Out of both caution and curiosity, the boys waited beside the road for the wagon to pass. As it flew by, they saw three men crowded together on the bench seat. One of the men, wearing rough work clothes with a hat low over his eyes, held the reins and urged the horse on when he saw the boys. The man in the middle sat up straight, staring straight ahead and wearing what looked like a white shirt, a coat, and a tie with no hat. The third man was dressed like the first, with a hat nearly hiding his face. He had one arm around the shoulders of the middle passenger. "Did you see the fellow in the middle?" Mort asked his younger brother after the wagon passed. "Yeah, he was kind of dressed up," responded Howell. Who was the man in the middle? Why was he dressed up? Over breakfast this morning, my wife, who usually accompanies me on these, asked me what I was going to talk about, and I said, grave robbers. She says, "I think I'll pass today." What the Sweeney brothers saw was a very active and criminal activity in the 1890s, early 1900s, grave robbers. Given that this individual was almost across the county line, indicates that frequently they were very successful, or they were able to do what they were trying to do. And every time a event like this happened, it left an empty grave somewhere. And if they did a good job, they covered it back up and smoothed it out, made it look like it did before they started, which means we got cemeteries around the county. People are probably still putting flowers on some of them, and there ain't nobody there because they were taken. Let me back up and talk about the cemetery so we know where things like this might have happened. The first cemetery in Rutherford County, anybody of you know where that was? What was the first church in Rutherford County? Not Rutherford County, Murfreesboro. Was the Presbyterian church. Somewhere about even before Murfreesboro was dreamed of, there was a congregation. An entrepreneur had rounded up some congregation, and when Murfreesboro was founded, he moved his little church into town, and about 1818 it became the Presbyterian church, First Presbyterian. They built on a piece of property that they didn't own. They thought it had been deeded to them, but the individual who gave the deed, a fellow named Captain Lytle, didn't own the property. So they were there on an invalid deed. But they built right next to, over on Vine Street, right next to where now is the cab stand. In fact, it's been a cab stand all my life, at the corner of what we refer to as the Old City Cemetery, originally the Presbyterian Church. When they built the church, they decided that the backyard, we'd call it, of the church would be used as a cemetery. This would have been about 1820-21 that they had the church built, and they dedicated the cemetery. Soon after the dedication of the cemetery, a local fella passed away, and his family wanted to use the church cemetery. It would have been the first burial in the cemetery. The church leadership, though, was a little uneasy because this individual owned and had operated the most notorious saloon gambling establishment on the square. The original businesses on the square, as you might guess, was dominated by saloons, good time houses, things of this sort, all servicing the courthouse, of course. The church said no, and they went back and forth for a while. Finally, the family says, okay, we're going to bury him in the front yard. It was about a block and a half off the square, which they did, but the controversy continued. Finally, the church relented, so we can safely say that the saloon keeper converted to Presbyterianism in order to get buried. The second cemetery was when the Methodists built their first church in Murfreesboro. And if you know where the Murfreesboro Housing Authority used to be, MTEMC, the utility, before that Soule College, that block was where the Methodists in 1824 built their first church. Now, it had a life and death history before that, because prior to 1820, it was used for any executions, hangings that were done in Rutherford County. We've documented 3. The law at the time said an execution has to be done in the county where there's a conviction, and it has to be done within 1 mile of the courthouse. So in the period 1813 to 1824, that Maple Street corner was vacant and available and was used for the executions. Nevertheless, the Methodists, they didn't take title to the property. Again, our friend Captain Lytle, he said, well, I'll let you use the property as long as it's a church. If it's not used for a church, it comes back to me. I hope he didn't have other executions planned. The Methodists built their church, and they dedicated the south end of the property as the cemetery. All of you familiar with our little Rover bus system, you know, where the Rover terminal is? Well, if you'll go walk around that terminal, you're walking on graves, remains. The cemetery was used for about 20 years. Over that time, quite a number of burials. In 1844, the church decided to move to bigger quarters, and they built and moved, and then they announced to the local population and their congregation that any family that has someone buried in the cemetery, we suggest you move it. In other words, it was left to the families to bear the expense, go the trouble of moving the graves. As you might expect, very few graves got moved. At that time, they were not sure where they would go, but the new city cemetery was just available. So that's one place where we're walking on the graves. The city cemetery was first opened in about 1830, when the family that were the daughter of our real true father, Colonel Hardy Murphy, his daughter owned the property, and she was married to a Hilliard. In the 1830s, they sold most of that property, which was around the Presbyterian Church, to the city to be used as a cemetery. A couple of interesting things. Remember, the church didn't have title. In fact, the title was in question. They surrounded it, and actually the property that the church had been built on was the Hilliard Murphy property. But they were members of the Presbyterian Church and apparently decided not to contest or argue about it. They did vigorously in other parts of town, but chose not to there. So the church remained without being challenged on the property. Her deed, though, when she sold the cemetery, said that the family plot, which was behind the church and the church cemetery, where her sister was buried, was not part of the sale. And to this day, that family plot remains the property of that family. Actually, by the time they got there, it was, what was the name? It was no longer Murphy. They had another family name, which I'll think of in a minute. So there's a part of that cemetery that doesn't belong to the city, and very few people could find it, but it's right behind where the church used to be, some distance. Jump ahead a minute. During the war, as I'm sure many of you read or heard, the church was basically dismantled. The reason being the military, when they were camped around here, needed bricks to build their brick ovens and other structures on the bases where they were camping. And they literally dismantled the church and used the bricks. If you're a souvenir hunter, go over past what used to be Procter, what was it, the bread plant over there off Church, and do a little digging along the river. We're still finding old bricks and such left over from the encampment. That's what happened to the church. So after the war, the Presbyterians said, well, we need to build a permanent building over on other property. And I have searched the deed records. They never signed anything, nobody else did. So that property is still untitled, but was simply taken over by the city because they had bought everything around it. So part of the city cemetery is untitled, and part of it still belongs to the Murphy family. The Confederates, after the Civil War, they called themselves United Confederate Veterans, working with the women of the community, which later became the Daughters of the Confederacy, decided that all of the Confederate bodies, they were scattered all over the county because they were usually buried by the local property owner wherever they fell. So there were many Confederate bodies scattered around the county. The ladies raised money and hired Colonel Anderson. If any of you are familiar with East Main Street, there's a beautiful old building, home that's called Daffodil Hill, was built by Anderson. He was before the war and again after the war, developer, built many of the brick masonry buildings that have survived from that time. One of them is where the Rutherford County Historic Society has their office now. But they hired Colonel Anderson to find the bodies, to dig them up, and to bring them all together, and they created a Confederate cemetery. The Confederate cemetery was located right between the two co-op facilities just off South Church. They were buried there, and in most cases they were able to find a few intact bodies. Frequently they were burying body parts and such, but they created the Confederate Cemetery. Today that's obviously paved over, so if you're walking or driving through there, you're driving over a lot of remains. But what happened to that cemetery is, well, not too long after it was set up, Evergreen Cemetery was created. Now, Evergreen began with 20 acres sold by Dr. Manny to the city for a cemetery. It included, the 20 acres included the Manny family cemetery, which is lost now. We've been through the cemetery many times trying to locate graves that predate the creation of Evergreen Cemetery, and we've not found any, so apparently that's lost. There is a Manny section that's all post-dated from the creation of the cemetery that could be where the family cemetery was. And then there were a lot of slave graves in the area, which I think also have probably been disturbed and obliterated as they used the rest of it. But if you go back and read the corporate records from that period, you find that the Board of Trustees for the early Evergreen Cemetery and the United Confederate Veterans were mostly the same people, the same fellows. They were community leaders. And I think, although this is a little bit of speculation what was going on, but I think what was going on is they set up a perpetual care arrangement, as was required then and now by the state, for Evergreen. But the Confederate Cemetery had no fund, no endowment beyond the living Confederate veterans who were taking care of it. So these community leaders decided, if we want the Confederate recognition cemetery not to be neglected and lost, we need to move it. And Evergreen literally gave the Confederate veterans what we now call the Confederate Circle. You can still see the Confederate battle flag flying over it. And once again, they dug up for the second time as much of the remains as they could find in the cemetery, moved them across town, and reburied them in the circle. If you look at the circle, there are no individual markers now. It's all almost as a mass grave. And in many cases, they were burying only parts and pieces, but they moved what they could. They knew they were leaving behind quite a bit, again, because they were parts and pieces. And that's what's been paved over there. So there's two places that we're walking and driving over the remains. Evergreen started out as Oakland Cemetery. And Dr. Manny, after the first year or so, decided it wasn't what he wanted, and went back to the city and said, "You got to change the name." Again, I can imagine people were asking him, "Is that where you live, or is that where the folks are buried?" Because they had the same name. Why they chose Evergreen, I don't know, except there are Evergreen cemeteries all over the country. It might just be a common name for cemeteries. 20 acres, it's obviously now about 100. The 20 acres is primarily adjacent to where the new police department is, up to about Evergreen Street. And Evergreen Street came in as the main gate originally. It continued that way until, let me see if I can find the date, 1922. Before 1922, the corner of the cemetery where Greenland and Highland meet, which now is heavily filled with older looking graves, was a brickyard. We're back to bricks again. The Henry family brickyard had been there for many, many years. The Henry family decided to sell after the death of one of the patriarchs of the family, and that was about 3 acres right there that was taken over by the cemetery. Today, when there's a burial in that section, I'm vice chairman of Evergreen, so I try to keep up with it. When there are burials in that section today, we're still digging up fragments of bricks. Because you know what they did when the bricks broke in the kiln? They pitched them over in a pile. And apparently that pile was just smoothed out when it was taken over. For many years, the old Henry house still stood on that part of the property and was the office of the cemetery, Evergreen Cemetery. If you'll go to the office today and ask to see records for burials back in the 1930s, you won't find any because the house burned down and took a good many of the records. We right now have a couple of members of the local historic society who are literally going through stone by stone in that older part and trying to get a good record again of just where people are. Of course, they don't know for sure anybody's down there or not, but we at least know what the stones say. Some of you may remember the name Beasley out at the State Teachers College when it was called that, Dean Beasley. Dean Beasley had the farm right, that would have been a little bit east of the cemetery, 64 acres. And the Beasley family made that available to the cemetery. So all the new part of the cemetery over there now was the Beasley farm. And it's close to 100 acres now. You'll notice, though, right in the middle, there's a place that doesn't have any graves. The drainage system for the university goes right through the cemetery. And the problem is, if you dig down 6 feet, you hit water, the water table right along there. The plan is to build a new office for the cemetery, and we're going to use that low area, build it up and use it for the office. Since it would never be appropriate for a grave. What became of the city cemetery? Well, let's fall back to the Civil War again just a minute. You've all heard the story, I hope, of how Nathan Bedford Forrest freed the city from that first occupation, which was a very brutal, oppressive occupation. Reminds me of some of the stories you hear about the conquering army. They'd say, round up a handful of citizens, shoot them so we get the attention of everybody else. That was very much what was going on in this first occupation. They had a hanging planned for the next morning. Fortunately, Bedford showed up and freed some of the leading citizens of the community at the time. In his raid, we have detailed that 26 of his men were killed. A very low number considering the size of the force that he was up against and captured. But 26 died in that battle. All 26 were buried by a thankful community in the back end of the city cemetery. Markers were put up, each one's identified. We've since identified them in our records. But of course the markers were what today we'd call temporary. They were wood or stone that would deteriorate. And they were just in the back of the cemetery where apparently no one else had any particular claim. When the Evergreen was opened in the early 1880s, the city announced that everybody who had, all families who had loved ones buried in the city cemetery, once again, we've heard this before, were encouraged to move the bodies. So again, it was going to be left to the families to bear the expense, go to the trouble of moving them all to Evergreen. Things were a little different. There were leading families in the community who had family plots and family remains in the city cemetery, and they essentially said, no, we're not going to do any moving. A few moved, but if you go in there now, you'll find these early family names about in the cemetery. And they said, no, not only are we not going to move, but when the widow dies, she's going to be buried next to her husband, so forth. So the city halfway backed off. They said, well, there'll be no more burials there except existing family plots. And some of those were filled. But the city quit maintaining the cemetery. And I'm sure many of you, like me, remember there have been times when you could hardly see in there for the growth and the neglect. Every once in a while, some private interest club or something would clean it up. But it's really been, I'd say, within the last 20 years that the city finally stepped up, turned it over to Parks and Recreation, and are maintaining it now to some extent. In 1905, let me pass something out. The city did make a decision with respect to the city cemetery. Just take one, pass them on around. I'm passing out a couple of maps that show the city cemetery at different times. Everybody got something? If you look at the map on the left side, if you're holding it in front of you, this is a map that was made in 1878, a little before Evergreen even opened up. And you'll see the cemetery. And note that Vine Street runs across the north side of the cemetery. Sevier Street ends, dead ends, at the fence around the cemetery. And State Street ends at the fence around the cemetery. Everybody oriented? Now look at the 1932 city map. You see what's changed? Sevier Street still dead ends, although it picks up on the other side, but ends at the cemetery. But State Street goes right straight through. In 1905, the city decided to extend State Street right through the cemetery. We found nothing in the way of communication with families or movement of graves or anything. And indeed, I have talked to at least one old fella, recently died, named William Crockett, black, lived over in the community there. And he remembered that his great uncle was part of the crew that laid State Street across. And he says, yeah, he was, according to family stories, he was finding buttons and other uniform pieces and apparel and what have you. 1905, the street was just cut through there, leaving part of the cemetery under, no pavement then, gravel, since paved, and part of the cemetery on the south side of State Street. In 1912, the city sold all of the cemetery property on the south side of State Street to developers. And if you go into the city records, the deed records, you can see that it was broken up, sold off in pieces, and built on. Today, if you'll drive State Street and stop there at the sidewalk right south of the cemetery, you're parking on top of a number of graves. The other side of the street is the Scales property. There's a house where T90 actually lived. It's now used for offices and storage. The funeral home is next to it. Behind it is the funeral home garage and equipment and such. I talked to our city councilwoman, Madeline Scales Harris, and she says, yeah, I remember my grandfather talking about how when they were building the house there, they were finding bones. I asked my source, original source, Mr. Crockett, I said, well, what did you think about that? He says, you know, folks back then just didn't have a lot of respect for the dead, but we did pass over them, run over them, and essentially develop it. So at least 3 places in the city where we're driving and walking over the remains of the old cemeteries. Let's go back to our Sweeney brothers. If you'll turn over your piece there, you'll see the part I read to you and an illustration by my wife of what's described. What was going on? Following the Civil War, the medical profession, for the first time, if you read back through the histories, began to have a scientific approach. Prior to the Civil War, it was an awful lot of mixings and what have you. In fact, you read some of the remedies, you wonder how anybody survived being treated with arsenic and such. But following the Civil War and the experience in the battlefield, the medical profession in its training became much more sensitive and focused on anatomy, the physiology of the body. And in order to teach the upcoming physicians, they had to have bodies. So most of the medical schools, including the University of Nashville, which later became Vanderbilt, made arrangements with the local authorities that any time there was an unclaimed body, it would be given to the school. Unclaimed bodies were paupers, in other words, nobody had money to bury, or criminals. And frequently the families, didn't want to have to take responsibility for the criminal remains. But that didn't even come close to meeting the educational needs. So almost all the schools went into what they would call a black market to purchase what they needed. And look back at it today, it was a social purpose, but it was also illegal. Some of the schools, we found one in Kansas City, the University of Kansas, had their own system and were paying directly for bodies that would be delivered to the school. Most of them worked through brokers, and this put the school one step away from it. And they'd buy from the broker, and the broker was dealing with the grave robbers. The problem, though, beyond having to wait for unclaimed bodies was back then, maybe changing some today, but back then, burial was by far the appropriate, preferred by almost every family way to treat the remains of their lost loved ones. So, the schools saw it as, I guess, a necessary evil. But there were other things that prompted the interest in the buried too. One was ransom. They'd steal the body from the grave and hold it for ransom, make the family pay again to recover the body and rebury it. Another reason was sideshows. If it was believed that the body was a dwarf or had some other anomaly, congenital defect or something like that, which would appeal to the morbid curiosity, that was a grave that would likely be exposed. And then the third reason was simple theft. Word would get out that so-and-so was buried with her wedding bands or her jewelry or whatever. Some interesting, on the ransom, several attempts were made that made the police records because it failed. So those are the ones I find. The remains of Ralph Waldo Emerson were targeted. In some cases, they would even get the casket up and be caught literally with dirty hands. Emerson's one example. John Jacob Astor, one of the wealthiest men in the world back in the early 1800s, 1890s, I mean. P.T. Barnum, I can see kind of a get back at him because he was one of the best markets for the freaks, the sideshows, and they attempted to steal his body. One of the most elaborate, and I've actually read a couple of books about the attempt to steal the body of Abraham Lincoln and hold it for ransom, I guess, to the whole United States. That one was foiled before they started digging, but it was clear the intent. One that succeeded, the name's not familiar, but the name of the individual was Lowe. He was the barefoot king of Hawaii before Hawaii was civilized and became a territory of the United States. His body was successfully stolen in 1899. His remains, however, were chopped up into little pieces and sold as good luck charms to the natives of the island. I think I remarked that most of the grave robbers were independent operators, but they would sell to brokers, and then the brokers were dealing with those who needed the bodies. There was some risks involved too. A story of some risk and occasionally some benefit. This was not in the United States, it was in South America, Peru. Grave robbers heard that there was jewelry buried with a recent burial. They exposed the body, they took the jewelry, and they left the body sitting at the edge of the grave. The body was a smallpox victim. And when the local authorities realized what was going on, they quickly reburied. But then you again had a fresh grave, and another set of grave robbers came along and dug it up again looking for the jewels, which of course had already been taken. Happened 3 times. Within a few months, the village in which it was happening had a smallpox epidemic, apparently from exposure to the remains. A happier story was in Minneapolis in 1895, where the grave robbers exhumed a grave just within hours after the family had left that night. And when they opened it, the guy says, "Whew, boy, I'm glad you came." And he was literally buried alive, which today seems ridiculous. But remember, many times there'd be deep comas before death, and sometimes they came back. If you doubt me on that, I'll give you the name and the reference. And then there's Eagleville. You're all familiar with the community of Eagleville. It's unique in Rutherford County, way down in the southwest corner. It's the only part of the county that is not within the Stones River watershed. When they drew the final parameters of Rutherford County, when Woodbury and Cannon County were created, the intent was to use the Stones River water system to define the county. Eagleville is part of the Harpeth River drainage system. It was in Williamson County. Eagleville, as it began to develop, looking for a better commercial relationship with a bigger city, approached Franklin and said, somebody over here needs to build us a turnpike. Nobody in Franklin or Williamson County was interested. But there had recently been a turnpike built from Murfreesboro to Salem. We still have Salem Road and such there. And the Ransom brothers, prominent name if you study the development of Rutherford County, the Ransom brothers down in Rockvale said, we'll build a turnpike. And they built a turnpike from Salem to Eagleville. So at that point, the community leaders in Eagleville said, we should be part of Rutherford County, petition the county, the state, and such. And that was done. So Eagleville has always been a little bit of an oddball in the county. Eagleville was remote, and in the 1890s, early 1890s, they had no physician. So a fellow showed up, Dr. C.B. Highmark. Lowmark would have been a better name. C.B. Highmark, and he was welcomed with open arms. He said, hey, I'm a Vanderbilt graduate, I'm a doctor, and I want to set up my practice in your community. And he was received with open arms. He moved in as a boarder at one of the finer homes there, but he insisted he needed another area for some of his work. And just outside of town, he leased a building, and he padlocked it. And he commenced his practice. At the time, none reacted, but every once in a while, someone who didn't seem to be critically ill was treated by Dr. Highmark and then died. And also, Dr. Highmark had a habit of driving to Nashville with a couple of young fellows every so often at night. It turns out he had hired a young man, Jody McGowan. And I don't know why the police reports, news reports are so specific, but it says Jody McGowan, white, and a, quote, Negro boy. So at least he was an equal employment opportunity. The two of them worked together with him. And he would occasionally go to Nashville, the three of them, loaded with some equipment of some kind. He'd get to Nashville, spend the night, swap horses, come back, be back in time to practice in the morning. This went on for several years, several being 4 or 5. One day in 1897, the local farmer, his last name was G-E-E, Henry G., was working in a field next to a family graveyard, and he saw a tuft hung in the barbed wire around the property. And at first he thought, some cattle must have gotten over there, and he went over to see if the fence was damaged. He looked more closely at it, and it clearly wasn't animal fur. It was gray hair, human hair. And this prompted him to go into the cemetery and look around. He found 2 graves open, 2 open graves. It was the Russell Cemetery, if you're interested, the corner of North Main and Oak Streets in today's Eagleville. And checking one of them was the remains from a fairly prominent family, Eva Jane Corbett, and the other, and I couldn't find full identification, but it was a Mrs. Pruitt. Another individual in the community, a grocer named Charles Gillespie, heard the report that 2 bodies of women had been dug up and became concerned about his own family cemetery, which was the Bennett Cemetery, because some kids in the store had mentioned there's a sinkhole out there around the grave. So he went to the family, it was called the Bennett Cemetery. He went there, and the coffin was still there, but it was empty. And a pile of clothes were left beside the open grave. Bennett immediately contacted, he must have had some political connections, Governor Taylor, and explained to him what happened and what seemed to be going on. The governor turned the matter over to state enforcement, and they fairly easily were able to first hear the suspicions, because immediately Dr. Highmark was in focus. They went to Nashville and found shipment records where Dr. Highmark was shipping big boxes of books, that's what it said on the box, to an outfit in Connecticut. And they followed the boxes, the trail of the delivery, particularly with the advantage of 3 bodies that had disappeared. While they were following the paper trail, Miss Pruitt was found in the woods, abandoned. Apparently, the robbers had gotten surprised or concerned and had abandoned that body. The other 2 had actually gone to the brokerage, and the 2 bodies were recovered. And the 2 bodies were brought back to Murfreesboro. And this is interesting. The Nashville Banner, on the day that the bodies were returned to Murfreesboro, wrote about, let's see, the article says, "There hasn't been such a country gathering since the day the bodies arrived in Murfreesboro. They were met by 2 horse-drawn hearses. A huge crowd followed the hearses back to the respective cemeteries, where they were reburied in unmarked graves." The Pruitt body had already been reburied. So it was quite a celebration. The community was really involved in the problem. What happened to Highmark? He was arrested, he was tried, and they had a little problem. There was no real law on the books at the time that applied to his misdeeds. Finally, they were able to convict him of a misdemeanor, which is essentially mistreatment of a dead body, and he was sentenced to 6 months and $150, which was the best they could come up with at the time. As a result of that case, now I'm always interested when I say a Rutherford County something that influences the state. The state legislature in 1899 did pass the law, and they made it a felony, punishable by imprisonment in the penitentiary for a period of not less than 2 or more than 5 years. I've always thought the medical profession has an awfully good lobby. Any person who removes any dead body or disinters any dead body from its place of interment for the purpose of selling or otherwise disposing of same to any person, company, or corporation for the purpose of dissection or otherwise mutilating said body without first having obtained the consent of the family or relatives of the deceased. And that's still the law in Tennessee. So a grave robber today could almost get off for 2 years and a modest fine. When I first learned the details of the story, the one thing that wasn't in our records here locally was what happened to Dr. Highmark. Well, he went to prison for 6 months. He paid the $150 fine, and he disappeared. So we went to the American Medical Association records, which list doctors all over the country. And we found Dr. C.B. Highmark practicing medicine in 1900 in Minnesota. So we went to the records of the Minnesota Doctors Association. And we found that in 1903, Dr. C.B. Highmark was in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, in private practice, small town. In 1904, he moved to Wendell, Minnesota, where he was named chairman of the Board of Health. enhancing his business opportunity, I guess. In 1910, he was in Ackley Township, Minnesota, back in general practice after having served 3 years as the county coroner. He's back in private practice in 1910. He must have died between 1910 and 1920. 1920 census, we didn't find him. Now you know why my wife didn't want to come listen to the presentation today.